Today, slavery still exists everywhere. No country, no matter how wealthy they are, is immune to it. I'm Ido Drent, and over the next 7 videos, we're going to be sitting down with members of the Tearfund team to talk about modern slavery. What it is, why it exists, what's being done about it around the world, and what the Bible has to say about it. Joining me today is Tearfund's Advocacy Specialist, Morgan, and we're going to discuss how slavery still exists today. Hi, Morgan.
Hi, Ido.
It's crazy to think that in this day and age that slavery still exists, right? For me, as a lot of people that I talk to, I kind of had the impression that it went away with the transatlantic slave trade, but that's not quite true, is it?
You're exactly right, but like many justice issues of our time, modern slavery has a larger impact on the developing world than it does on economically well-off countries. Too often, the individuals who are trafficked, tricked, or coerced into slavery are from really vulnerable countries, some of which Tearfund actually works in. The impact within these countries is huge, so you have separated families, traumatized individuals, an economy totally built on exploitation. Really, the list is endless.
So why don't we just start at the beginning, because I often hear the words, modern slavery or slavery and then trafficking, and I hear them being used interchangeably. So why don't we start with just defining what's the difference between those two things?
That's a common misconception. They're definitely different. So while there's no legal definition of modern slavery, the United Nations defines slavery as an umbrella term, covering practices such as forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and human trafficking. Essentially, it refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, and abuse of power. Trafficking, on the other hand, is the means by which a person can end up enslaved, so end up in modern slavery. It refers to the illegal recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, and receiving of people for the purpose of exploiting them.
So as you mentioned, vulnerability seems to be like a precursor or a common kind of requirement in order for slavery to exist. What makes these countries or communities vulnerable to these practices?
It really comes down to 3 reasons. So you have poverty, disasters, and conflicts. Poverty leads people into extreme desperation, which makes them really vulnerable to deception. So traffickers know this, and they intentionally prey on these people because they're just easier to exploit. We're talking about families who can't afford to provide for their children, or children who have had to leave school to find work. People who are in really, really tough situations that are just unimaginable. And a shocking number of stories from our partners follow the exact same pattern. You got a young, poor, educated person, and they're offered a lucrative job in another province or another country, but then they arrive to find themselves trapped in exploitative conditions and unable to leave.
And I'd imagine that obviously debt ties into this as well, where families, are in debt and they, don't have enough money to pay for that debt, so they are more susceptible to these kind of lucrative opportunities that, would allow them to kind of service that debt. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And heartbreakingly, when large families are faced with desperate circumstances, it's actually not uncommon for parents to sell one child to feed the rest. More commonly though, parents or caregivers are lured into sending a child with traffickers with the promise that the child will have a better life, a better education than what they could provide. But too often, these promises are a total lie, and the child's never seen again by the family.
Right, so if someone turns up saying, hey, we've got this incredible job for your child, you just send them with us and then you can pay for your debts or to survive or whatnot.
It's totally built on lies.
That's insane. So obviously education would play a big part in that. I'd imagine that, a lack of education in these communities, these poor communities, would kind of just compound the effect of, or the ability for these people to be trafficked.
Because education opportunities are lacking for people in these communities, as you mentioned, this decreases both the work opportunities that they're able to get and their knowledge of their rights. So one of the most effective ways to reduce a person or a community's vulnerability to trafficking is through education and awareness, so they're aware of what their rights are.
Because then they can identify the red flags, or
exactly,
someone turning up saying, hey, this is this incredible opportunity, it seems too good to be true, and then being educated, they actually go, oh, that is too good to be true, and they won't kind of get caught up in it.
Exactly.
So I'd imagine also that a lack of opportunity would cause people to kind of leave their home country or leave their home just to kind of look for greener pastures or better opportunities, right? But equally increasing the risk of them being trafficked?
Yeah, so poverty is one of the main drivers of the movement of people from one location to another in search of a better life, which we call migration. And a lack of safe migration options or legal migration options for people often means that they are prime targets for traffickers. So both the journey, due to the fact that it is typically illegal, and the destination can be perilous and extremely dangerous. Over the last decade, we've all become really familiar with the sickening stories of boats filled with migrants capsizing or sinking completely in the Mediterranean Sea. Since 2014, more than 18,000 people have drowned or disappeared in the Mediterranean Sea while trying to reach, Europe and what they see as freedom. The majority of these people are asylum seekers and migrants who have enlisted the help of smugglers to help them make this dangerous journey. And sometimes these operations can lead to human trafficking.
And of course, those people that, are the lucky ones that make it to their destination, I'd imagine that they are still vulnerable. They've left kind of their community structures back home. And now they're equally in a place where they've got there illegally, so you can't just pick up the phone and call the police because suddenly you get in trouble that way as well. So it just kind of, it just doesn't seem like there's a good option for them there, right? They remain vulnerable even now that they've reached their destination. Another thing that causes modern slavery is conflict and natural disaster. Can you share a little bit about those two? Obviously, they share quite a few same characteristics, but how they make people vulnerable and how they make people susceptible to be trafficked?
They do have very similar characteristics. Traffickers often prey on those who are impacted by conflict or natural disasters because these present the ideal conditions for trafficking due to the chaos and the economic disruption and the vulnerability that ensues following a disaster or conflict. People's lives are totally disrupted, and sadly, human rights abuses inevitably are going to occur. A shocking example of this can be seen in what happened after the devastating Boxing Day tsunami that hit Southeast Asia in 2004. In the carnage immediately following the disaster, traffickers were some of the first people to arrive on scene, ready to find and sell children who had been separated from their families or, orphaned by the disaster. It was terrible.
So what would that look like? Would that look like someone turning up saying, "Oh, we'll help you find your mum or your parents," and then they'll just ship them off overseas or something?
Yeah, there are many ways, deception. They use deception and then they use coercion, essentially.
That's insane that in that situation, someone would be able to stoop that low. And I guess that's the thing about this, right? The people we're dealing with aren't very nice people, are they? This is a pretty dark world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we live in a broken world and there's so many injustices.
Yeah.
And this is just one of them.
I know conflict obviously causes slavery as well. Can we look at the way, like a recent example, say the Syrian civil war, which I know has displaced millions of people. Can you shed some light on how that works?
You're right, the Syrian civil war began in 2011 and displaced approximately 6.5 million people internally and 5.5 million refugees registered in surrounding countries. Exploitation of people made vulnerable by the civil war has been absolutely prolific. Groups from all sides have been forcibly recruiting orphans or solo children as child soldiers for the conflict. With refugee quotas in neighboring countries really limited, people trying to escape Syria are increasingly turning to traffickers to get them to safety. And Syrian refugees who enter a neighboring country via traffickers or other illegal means are then not eligible to work in that country, so they're not able to, earn a living wage. And as a result, many refugees are living in total poverty, with 60% of refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt all living below the poverty line.
Man, and I read somewhere that in Lebanon, there, 1 in 4 people is a refugee, and there's been massive increases in the child labour, right? Something like 60 to 70%, of the Syrian refugee children are working there, right?
Yeah, and in Syria, refugee girls are forced into early marriages in an attempt to secure their economic future. And something called survival sex is also a growing issue for female refugees as women take desperate measures to provide for their families, to feed their families. And without proper work permits, forced labor is really common among refugees in neighboring Middle Eastern countries, but then also for those that manage to reach Europe.
Same issues occurred during the COVID pandemic, right? So you mentioned survival sex. I read that as a result of people, losing their jobs and trying to put food on the table, the only way they could do that was to, prostitute one of their daughters, say.
Yeah, it's horrible. And this is actually happening a lot in Central and South America. is terrible.
I honestly, I can't imagine, as a father of 3 kids, I've got 2 young daughters, I can't imagine being placed in a position where literally my best option to put food on the table would be to sell one of my daughters. That just seems like such a hopeless situation to be in. It just feels like these circumstances that these refugees and migrants are placed in just feels so completely unfair and unjust, right?
Yeah, it's one of the major injustices in our world today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing a bit more. Working to end modern slavery is something that Tearfund does with great conviction, because we believe it's a violation of human rights, and it's also an injustice that our faith compels us to respond to. I hope this was informative. Join me over the next 6 videos as we take a deep dive into this massive issue.